She found it on the pavement outside a restaurant where a single dinner cost more than her monthly rent, and it was thick with cash and carried a name nobody in that city said out loud without checking over their shoulder first. She could have kept the money. Every rational calculation pointed toward keeping it. Instead, she walked back inside, set the wallet on the bar, and asked for nothing in return. That was the moment Nadia Reyes became the most interesting woman in the room, though nobody in that restaurant knew it yet, and she herself would not understand how thoroughly her life had just changed until a black car she had never seen before pulled up outside her building 48 hours later, and the most dangerous man in New York stepped out of it looking specifically for her. Nadia Reyes was 29 years old, stood 5'4", and wore a size 20, and she had spent the better part of a decade learning, with the particular discipline of someone who has been corrected by the world often enough to internalize the lesson, exactly how much space she was entitled to occupy. The answer the world kept offering her was somewhere between very little and none at all, depending on the room, depending on the people in it, depending on the particular flavor of cruelty that walked past her on any given Tuesday. She had grown up in Washington Heights, the daughter of a woman who cleaned houses in Riverdale and a father who drove a delivery truck until his back gave out. And she had been the first person in her family to attend a 4-year university, earning a degree in accounting from Fordham that she had carried into the working world with the kind of quiet, stubborn pride that nobody in her family had the vocabulary to celebrate, but everybody felt in their chests when they looked at her framed diploma on her mother's kitchen wall. None of that had made the corporate world any kinder. She had spent 3 years at a mid-sized financial consulting firm in Midtown, the only plus-size woman on a floor where every other woman looked as though she had been assembled from spare parts of a fashion catalog, and she had been, by any measurable standard, the sharpest analyst in her department. She had an almost physical relationship with numbers, the way a musician has an ear for pitch, a gift for seeing patterns inside data the way other people see faces in clouds, fast, involuntary, and entirely accurate. None of that had mattered when her managing director had taken a dislike to her presence at client meetings, describing her, in a voicemail she had heard accidentally through a conference room door, as not projecting the image the firm wanted associated with its brand. She had been let go 2 months later for reasons attributed entirely to budget restructuring, and 3 years of brilliant, thankless work had been filed away under a polite severance agreement and the silent understanding that she should not expect a strong reference. She worked now at a nonprofit consignment shop called Second Chance on the western edge of the Flatiron District, sorting donations, pricing inventory, managing the books for a director who barely noticed she was there except when the numbers did not add up, at which point he noticed her very much indeed. It paid $34,000 a year, which was enough to share a 2-bedroom apartment in Inwood with a roommate and eat most of her meals at home. She did not complain about this. She had stopped complaining about most things around the time she turned 26, not out of contentment, but out of the particular, exhausted practicality of a woman who had learned that complaining into a void costs energy she could not afford to spend. She wore her dark hair pulled back at work, owned 3 cardigans in rotation, and had cultivated the specific art of moving through a room in a way that generated as little friction as possible, keeping her elbows in, her voice low, her presence minimal, her apologies reflexive. She had gotten very good at it. It had not made her happy, exactly, but it had made her efficient, and for a long time efficiency was the best substitute for happiness she had managed to locate. On the Thursday evening in question, she had stayed late at the shop reconciling the quarterly donation ledger, a task nobody else wanted to do and that she had quietly taken on because it gave her something to be genuinely useful at. And she had walked out into the cool October air of the city just after 9 in the evening, heading toward the subway 3 blocks south. She passed the restaurant on the corner of 22nd and 6th, a place called Meridian that she had only ever seen from the outside, the kind of establishment with a door attendant and a lighting scheme designed to make rich people look even more beautiful than they already believed themselves to be. The wallet was lying on the pavement just outside the entrance, half tucked against the base of one of the planters flanking the door, and Nadia saw it the way she saw most things that required attention, immediately and without effort. She picked it up without thinking twice, opened it only far enough to find an ID card so she could determine whether to hand it to the restaurant or flag down a passing officer, and what she found inside made her go very still on the pavement while the October wind moved around her like she was a stone in a river. The wallet was Italian leather, old and beautifully maintained, the kind of object that communicated value without advertising it. It contained 4 credit cards, a New York State driver's license belonging to one Damian Caruso, age 35, with an address in Tribeca, and a sum of cash that Nadia counted twice before she believed the total, which was $41,000 in banded hundreds so crisp they might have been printed that afternoon. She stood on the pavement with $41,000 in her hands and thought about several things in rapid succession. She thought about her mother's kitchen faucet that had been dripping for 6 months and that the landlord was not going to fix before spring. She thought about the student loan payment that had been quietly accruing interest for the past 2 years while she paid the minimum and tried not to look directly at the balance. She thought about the security deposit she would need for an apartment of her own if she ever stopped splitting rent with a roommate who played guitar at midnight and left dishes in the sink for days at a time. She thought about all of those things, and then she walked back into the restaurant and returned the wallet to the bartender, explaining where she had found it, asking that he see it got to the right person, and leaving without providing her name because it had not occurred to her that her name would be wanted. She was on the subway platform before she fully processed what she had done, and by the time her train arrived, she had already filed the incident away in the practical, forward-moving part of her brain where she kept decisions that did not benefit from second-guessing and gone back to thinking about the quarterly ledger. What Nadia could not have known, watching her train pull into the station with her cardigan pulled tight against the platform draft, was that the name on that driver's license belonged to a man who had not lost anything by accident in a very long time, and that the wallet had not been left outside that restaurant carelessly. Damian Caruso was 35 years old, and he had been running the Caruso organization since he was 30, inheriting control of an enterprise that spanned 3 boroughs of New York in the same quiet, surgical manner that distinguished everything he did, not with a public announcement or a dramatic coronation, but with a series of private, irrevocable decisions that left anyone who might have disputed his succession either persuaded, relocated, or simply no longer relevant. His father had built the organization through volume and brutality, a man who treated fear as a renewable resource and burned through loyalty the way other men burned through money. Damian had watched his father's methods with the detached, analytical attention of a man cataloging what not to do, and had spent a decade quietly building a parallel infrastructure of precision, of intelligence, of patience so practiced it registered to the people around him as something close to supernatural. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The particular quality of his silence was enough, a stillness that preceded his responses with the weight of absolute certainty, as though the outcome of every room he entered had already been decided before he walked through the door. He was broad-shouldered and dark-haired, with the kind of sharp, composed features that looked as though they had been designed specifically to give nothing away, and he dressed with the discreet, authoritative elegance of a man who had learned early that the right suit was a language that communicated power without requiring him to speak. He had left his wallet outside the restaurant deliberately, an old tradecraft habit, a test he ran on the neighborhoods his organization operated in, leaving something valuable in a location his people monitored to gauge what kind of person walked that pavement on a given evening. In 10 years of running variations of that test, he had never once had the wallet returned intact and without incident by a stranger who left no name, asked for no reward, and appeared to have no knowledge whatsoever of who the wallet belonged to. His man outside, a quiet and capable enforcer named Marco, had watched a heavy-set young woman in a shapeless cardigan pick the wallet up off the pavement, count the cash with the focused efficiency of someone accustomed to handling numbers, stand very still for approximately 30 seconds, and then walk back into the restaurant to return it to the bartender without the smallest hesitation and without a word about the cash. Marco had gotten a clear photo before she reached the entrance. Damian had studied it for a long time after Marco sent it through, which was unusual for him, because Damian Caruso did not typically study anything for longer than it required to be understood. 48 hours later, Nadia was on her lunch break, sitting on a bench in Madison Square Park with a container of leftover rice and beans from the previous night's dinner, when a shadow fell across her, and she looked up to find a man she had not seen before standing over her with his hands in the pockets of a suit that cost more than her annual salary. He was not the kind of man you forgot once you'd seen him, and yet she was entirely certain she had not seen him before, which meant he had sought her out rather than encountered her, a distinction that sent a cold thread of unease through her chest before she had consciously identified why. "Nadia Reyes," he said, his voice low and unhurried, as though they were completing a sentence they had started somewhere else. It was not a question. "That depends on who's asking," Nadia said, because she had been raised in Washington Heights and had developed a healthy suspicion of men who knew her name before she'd given it to them. The faintest suggestion of something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement, not quite respect, something between the two that sat uneasily with the absolute authority radiating off the rest of him. He sat down on the opposite end of the bench without asking, which annoyed her, and pulled out a slim leather card case. He set his card on the bench between them. She looked at it. Then she looked at the name, and felt the world rearrange itself very slightly around the edges. "I returned your wallet to the bartender," Nadia said, keeping her voice steady out of sheer stubbornness. "I'm aware," Damien replied. "I'd like to know why." "Because it wasn't mine," she said. "That's the complete answer. I don't need a follow-up meeting." He did not react to that the way most people reacted to being dismissed, which was to redouble their persistence. He simply looked at her, unhurried, with the kind of focused attention that made her uncomfortably aware of her own heartbeat. $41,000, he said. "In cash. No CCTV where you were standing. No witnesses. You could have walked away and nobody would have been any the wiser." "I would have been the wiser," Nadia said. "I knew what I was doing. That's exactly my point." He picked up his card and held it out to her. She did not take it immediately, which he seemed to notice. "I'm not recruiting you," he said. "I'm expressing gratitude." "There's a difference. People who just want to express gratitude send a thank you note," Nadia said. "They don't track down a stranger's lunch break." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not read, then set the card on the bench again. "I would like to buy you dinner," he said. "To say thank you, in person, in a way that is proportionate to what you did." "You don't know me well enough to know what's proportionate," Nadia said. "No," he agreed. "I would like to." She looked at the card. She looked at the man. She looked at her container of leftover rice and beans, which had gone cold while they were talking, and experienced a complicated, somewhat unflattering wave of self-awareness about the contrast presented by the current scene. "I'm not the kind of woman men like you take to dinner," she said flatly, and she said it the way she said most things that embarrassed her, quickly and without softening it, because it was easier to say the thing herself than to wait for someone else to say it first. Damien's expression changed, and the shift was small but unmistakable, a tightening at the jaw, the particular kind of stillness that suggested the sentence she had just spoken had landed somewhere it was not expected and had caused some kind of reaction he was not prepared to show. "I would be interested," he said slowly, "in knowing what kind of woman you believe men like me take to dinner." "Thinner ones," Nadia said. "Quieter ones. Ones who understand what they're supposed to be decorating." The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough to become uncomfortable, and then Damien Caruso said, in a voice that did not rise and did not soften, "I have never in my life taken a woman to dinner to use her as a decoration, and I would ask you not to make assumptions about my preferences based on a 30-second conversation." He stood, buttoning his jacket. "Friday evening. 8 o'clock. The address is on the card." He walked away before she could decide whether she was going to say no, which she suspected was intentional, and Nadia sat on her bench in Madison Square Park holding the card of the most dangerous man in New York and understanding, with a slow, sinking certainty, that she was going to say yes, despite every sensible instinct she possessed, because she had returned a wallet full of $41,000 to a stranger, and the universe had apparently decided to answer that honesty with a complication she had absolutely not budgeted for. She wore the best dress she owned, which was a deep green wrap dress she had bought on clearance 2 years earlier and rarely had occasion to wear, and she spent 20 minutes in the elevator lobby of her building on Friday evening deeply reconsidering every decision she had made since Tuesday afternoon before reminding herself that the worst possible outcome of a dinner with a stranger was a bad meal, and she had survived considerably worse than that. The restaurant Damien had chosen was not Meridian, which she appreciated without knowing why, until she sat down across from him and realized the distinction was deliberate, that bringing her back to the place where she had been reduced to a good anecdote would have been a bad choice, and he had known it without being told. He was already seated when she arrived, which gave her the brief advantage of crossing the room without his eyes on her from the door, though she was aware of his gaze the moment she turned from the host's stand and found him watching her from a corner table with the same focused, patient quality she had clocked on the park bench. As if she were a problem he was genuinely interested in solving. They ate. He asked questions that were not the questions she expected. Not what do you do and where are you from in the polite, data-gathering way of a man filling time, but questions with actual texture. What she had noticed in the quarterly donation ledger that had kept her late on the Thursday, she found his wallet. Why she had left corporate accounting. What the numbers had looked like in the moment before she understood what they meant. She answered him more honestly than she intended to, partly because the questions were good enough to deserve honest answers, and partly because Damien Caruso had a quality she had rarely encountered in any room she'd occupied, the quality of someone who actually listened to what was said rather than waiting for a pause long enough to speak into. By the time the main course arrived, she had told him about the managing director who had let her go rather than let a plus-sized woman sit in client meetings, and something about the dinner and the wine and the genuine attention of this utterly terrifying man had lowered her defenses far enough that she said it plainly rather than packaging it in the careful, self-deprecating humor she usually used to make the story land without making anyone uncomfortable. Damien listened to the whole of it without interjecting once. When she finished, he set his fork down, which she had already learned in 3 days of somehow knowing who he was meant he was about to say something worth hearing. You told me earlier you're not the kind of woman men like me take to dinner, he said. Nadia looked at her wine glass. I did. I've been thinking about that sentence since Tuesday, he said. I would like to tell you something plainly. Since you appear to prefer plain speech over the decorative kind, she looked up at him. Every person who has ever sat at a table with me has wanted something, he said. Every negotiation, every alliance, every relationship in my entire adult life has been initiated by someone who needed something from me and found the most efficient path to extracting it. You found $41,000 in cash attached to my name, with no witnesses and no consequences, and the thought of keeping it did not appear to cross your mind as a viable option. That is the most extraordinary thing that has happened to me in a very long time, and I am not a man who is easily surprised. I didn't do anything exceptional, Nadia said. I returned something that wasn't mine. Most people, Damien replied evenly. Consider returning $41,000 in cash to be exceptional. I would like to understand you better. I am not interested in what you look like or what category you believe men like me put women in. I am interested in the fact that you are one of approximately 3 people I have encountered in 15 years who apparently wanted nothing from me, and I find that remarkable enough to pursue. Nadia stared at him across the table, the warm amber light of the restaurant doing nothing to make the situation feel less surreal, and understood that she was being offered something she did not have a category for, a version of being seen that had nothing to do with what she weighed or what she looked like in her clearance dress, or how many people in the room had looked at her with the particular, familiar mix of pity and dismissal she had grown so accustomed to she barely noticed it anymore. What exactly does pursuing it look like? She asked. In your world, it looks like this, Damien said simply. Dinners. Conversations. Until I understand you well enough to know what you actually need, at which point I intend to provide it. That's a very controlled way of describing what normal people would call getting to know someone, Nadia said. His mouth curved slightly. I've been told I have a controlled way of describing most things, he said. You'll get used to it, or you won't. I'd rather you tell me which 3 weeks of dinners became 4. And Nadia stopped telling herself each one would be the last, mostly because the argument she was having with herself about why she should stop was losing steadily to the increasingly undeniable evidence that the hours she spent across a table from Damien Caruso were the only hours in any given week when she did not feel the low, persistent hum of self-erasure that had become the background noise of her adult life. He did not treat her the way she had been trained to expect from the world, as something to be managed, accommodated, politely minimized. He treated her the way he apparently treated every problem he found genuinely interesting, with full, focused, relentless attention, and the experience was profoundly disorienting in a way she was finding progressively more difficult to dismiss as irrelevant. The wardrobe conversation happened on the 3rd dinner, not because he brought it up, but because she arrived in the same green wrap dress she had worn to the first one, and he looked at it the way he looked at everything, without judgment and without apology, and then said that if she wore the same dress to every dinner, he would eventually be forced to tell her she was not, by any measure, difficult to dress well, and that he found it strange that nobody appeared to have told her that before. Nadia had put down her menu and looked at him across the candles for a long moment. "People my size don't get told they're easy to dress," she said. "They get told what to avoid and what conceals and what reads as slimming. And the cumulative effect of being told those things for 20 years is that you stop buying things that make you visible, because visibility has only ever been a liability." Damien was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was deciding precisely what to say next rather than filling space. "You have spent a very long time learning to make yourself smaller," he said. "I find that I object to it on a level that surprises me." "You object to it," Nadia repeated, one eyebrow lifting. "As in, personally, as in, I find it a significant and ongoing waste," he said, his voice carrying none of the softness that might have made the statement feel like flattery and all of the certainty that made it feel like an assessment he had arrived at independently and was not interested in being argued out of. He arranged, without making a production of it, for a woman named Carmen, who designed private label clothing for several of his business associates, to come to the apartment above Nadia's shop, where she was staying late one Saturday while the director was out of town, with several pieces made in Nadia's measurements. Carmen was brisk and efficient and spent no time whatsoever discussing what Nadia's body needed to hide, focusing entirely on what it was already doing that was worth building on, which was a vocabulary Nadia had literally never heard applied to herself before and which she was entirely unprepared for. She tried on a deep burgundy structured blazer that fit her shoulders the way clothes very rarely fit her shoulders, and looked in the staff bathroom mirror and experienced the strange, vertiginous sensation of a woman who had been invisible for so long she had forgotten what she actually looked like when the clothes were not specifically designed to make her disappear. She did not cry, because she was not someone who cried easily, but the back of her throat ached in the specific way it did when she was suppressing something that wanted out. She wore the blazer to the next dinner, and when Damien looked at her across the restaurant, the stillness in his expression shifted very slightly, something warming at the edges in a way she suspected he had not entirely intended her to see. Before he collected himself and handed her the menu with the same composure he brought to everything. "You look like yourself," he said. "I'm not sure I know what that looks like yet," Nadia admitted quietly, setting the menu down. "I'm starting to," Damien replied, and said nothing else about it. But his eyes returned to her face throughout the evening with a frequency and an intention that felt considerably different from the careful, controlled attention he had been giving her from the beginning, something less managed in it, something closer to the involuntary. Marco, who drove the car and said very little, mentioned to no one in particular on the drive home from the fourth dinner that it had been a long time since the boss had lingered over a meal, and said it only once, and did not need to say it again. The annual benefit for the Caruso Foundation's Arts Endowment was held in the third week of November at a private event space on the Upper East Side, and Damien told Nadia she would be attending with him in the same tone he used when he had already made a decision and was informing her of it rather than requesting her agreement. She spent 2 days arguing herself into and out of it in roughly equal proportions, and on the night itself stood in front of the mirror in the deep navy gown Carmen had made for the occasion, a deliberately architectural piece with a structured bodice and a sweep of fabric across one shoulder that did not apologize for a single square inch of her, and decided that the woman looking back at her from the mirror was someone she was prepared to introduce to a room even if the room was full of people who had already decided what she was before she arrived. The event space was a cathedral of old money and new ambition, every surface lit with the warm, flattering glow of money that had learned not to show itself too obviously, and the guests who moved through it wore the particular practiced ease of people who had been performing wealth for so long they no longer remembered doing it. Nadia walked in with Damien's hand at the small of her back, warm and unhurried, and felt the room's attention shift toward them with the particular quality she had learned to recognize over the past month, the slight recalibration of every person in the vicinity trying to reconcile the man they knew with the woman at his side. She had anticipated it. She had not fully anticipated how it would feel to stand inside it instead of watching it happen to someone else, and she kept her chin up and her shoulders back the way she had practiced in her apartment bathroom the previous evening, reminding herself that the burgundy blazer had taught her something she was still in the process of learning, which was that visible did not automatically mean vulnerable. The woman who intercepted them near the bar was named Serena Fontaine, a sculptor of some reputation whose work the Foundation had previously funded and who appeared to move through Damien's social world with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had been in his orbit for years and had developed opinions about it. She was precisely the kind of woman who had featured in every cruel internal calculation Nadia had made about her own inadequacy, tall and angular and dressed in the kind of architectural minimalism that required a body with no excess anywhere to pull off correctly. "Damien," Serena said, her voice carrying the smooth warmth of a woman accustomed to being delighted by her own arrivals. "I didn't see you earlier. I was starting to worry you'd sent a representative." Her gaze moved to Nadia with the practiced efficiency of a woman who knew exactly how to look at someone and make them understand precisely where they ranked, traveling the full length of her and returning to Damien's face with a small, patient smile. "And you've brought a guest. How lovely. I don't think we've met." The way she said "we've met" made it clear she could not conceive of a context in which they would have. "Nadia Reyes," Nadia said before Damien could speak, because she had spent 29 years waiting for rooms to speak about her, and she was done with it. "Good to meet you." Serena's smile adjusted slightly, the kind of adjustment a woman makes when she has been answered more directly than expected and needs a moment to recalibrate. "How did you two meet?" she asked, directing the question at Damien with the particular, proprietary tilt of someone who expected the story to be either amusing or brief. "She returned my wallet," Damien said, "with $41,000 in it. She didn't take $1 and she didn't leave her name." He paused, and the pause was the kind that carried weight in rooms like this one, the kind that preceded a point. "I have been trying to understand her ever since. I expect it will take me quite some time." The temperature in the immediate area dropped several degrees, and Serena's smile became the kind of smile that is held in place entirely by will rather than feeling. A cluster of guests nearby who had drifted close enough to hear had gone very still. "That's quite a story," Serena said carefully. "It's not a story," Damien replied, his voice perfectly level. "It's what happened. And if you have further questions about how Nadia Reyes came to be standing at my side tonight, I would suggest you direct them to me rather than to her through me, because she is considerably better at answering for herself than most people I know." Serena excused herself with a graciousness that had gone visibly tight around the edges, and Nadia stood in the resulting quiet with her pulse hammering somewhere behind her collarbone and the slow, warming certainty spreading through her chest that she had just watched a man say her name in front of a room full of people who mattered to him and mean every syllable of it. The hidden competence moment arrived not dramatically but sideways, the way the most important things in Nadia's life had always arrived, through a side door she had not been watching. 6 weeks after the dinner at the park, Damien had taken to calling her in the evenings, conversations that began with the stated pretext of confirming arrangements for the following week and gradually extended, without acknowledgement on either side, into an hour of quiet, unhurried exchange that had become the part of her day she protected most fiercely from interruption. On a Thursday evening in early December, he called her while she was still at Second Chance, finishing the monthly reconciliation, and she answered with a distracted greeting because she was midway through a ledger entry that was not resolving the way it should. She explained the discrepancy in passing, the specific category of error she was seeing repeated at intervals in a set of vendor invoices she had been asked to reconcile for a nonprofit client of the shop's director. And the line went quiet in the way it went quiet when Damien was genuinely thinking rather than pausing. "Say that again," he said. "The pattern you just described." She described it again, more precisely this time. The way certain invoice amounts were rounded to specific thresholds, the way the vendor IDs repeated across transactions that should have represented different suppliers. The particular signature of a shell vendor scheme she recognized because she had been shown examples of it in a fraud detection seminar she had attended during her 3 years at the consulting firm. The silence that followed was the longest one she had experienced from him, which told her something she had not yet learned to fully catalog. "Nadia," he said finally, "I need you to look at something for me tomorrow. Not for the shop. For me," he told her then, in precise, unemotional terms, that the organization's legitimate business holdings included a commercial property management company he had been building for 3 years as the primary vehicle for transitioning his family's enterprise into something legal and sustainable. And that for the past 4 months the company's financial statements had been carrying anomalies his internal accountant had attributed to data migration errors following a software upgrade. Anomalies that Damien had accepted as an explanation because he trusted the accountant in question and because the amounts involved, while not trivial, were not large enough to trigger the alarm threshold he had built into his oversight process. The pattern Nadia had just described on a Thursday evening over the phone while reconciling a non-profit's vendor ledger was identical, feature for feature, to the pattern she would have expected to find if someone were systematically redirecting small amounts from the property company's operating accounts into a shell structure designed to be invisible until it was large enough to matter. She looked at the statements he sent through his secure filing system that night, sitting cross-legged on her apartment floor with her laptop balanced on her knees and a cup of cold tea beside her, and worked through them with the same focused, involuntary efficiency she brought to every set of numbers she had ever been given, the part of her brain that had always been her actual gift activating without ceremony the way it always had, whether or not anyone in the room thought to use it. By 2 a.m, she had the full picture. The amounts diverted over a 4-month period totaled just under $900,000, redirected across 47 transactions to 3 shell entities registered in Delaware, Connecticut, and Nevada respectively, all 3 bearing corporate registration signatures that, when she cross-referenced the filing dates and registered agent information, pointed with uncomfortable clarity toward a single coordinating individual. She called Damien at 2 a.m. because the number he had given her was the number he answered at any hour, and when he picked up she simply said the name of the internal accountant she had identified from the filing patterns, and the silence that followed was the particular, absolute silence of a man receiving information that costs him something significant to absorb. "The accountant's name is Reeves," Nadia said carefully. "Gregory Reeves. He's been with you for 6 years according to the company header on the statements you sent me, and the shell registrations I found track back to a registered agent in Stamford, Connecticut, that filed incorporation documents for all 3 entities in a single 90-minute window in August. That's a very short window for 3 separate filings. Someone was in a hurry, or someone was confident enough in the relationship to not worry about the timing being obvious." Another silence. "Then, send me the filing documentation already attached," she said. "I sent it 2 minutes before I called." She heard him inhale, a slow and controlled breath that communicated more than anything he might have said with words, and then he said her name, just her name, in a tone she had not heard from him before, stripped of the careful composure he wore everywhere else in his life, the way he wore his bespoke suits, and underneath it was something raw and unguarded and entirely real. "You found this in 4 hours," he said. "Starting from a cold set of statements with no context and no briefing, I have a very specific kind of brain," Nadia said. "It's always been better at this than most things I've been paid to do." "That ends," Damien said. Starting immediately, she understood what he meant, and for once, instead of arguing the point, she let the silence confirm it. Gregory Reeves had been the Caruso organization's internal accountant for 6 years, a meticulous, pleasant, largely invisible man who wore beige cardigans and brought homemade cookies to the office at Christmas and had never once, in 6 years, given Damien any reason to question his arithmetic or his loyalty. This was, as it turned out, not because Reeves had no reason to betray the organization, but because he had been waiting, with a patience that would have impressed Damien if it had not been aimed at him, for the right moment to make that betrayal sufficiently final to escape from. The $900,000 was not the full amount. Nadia understood that by Friday morning, going back through the filing documentation with the specific goal of mapping the full structure rather than confirming the pattern she had already identified. The Delaware, Connecticut, and Nevada entities were staging vehicles, not the final destination. Each one fed into a trust structure registered in the Cayman Islands under a beneficial ownership arrangement designed to be invisible from the company's New York-based accounting software. And the trust held not $900,000, but $4.2 million, accumulated across 14 months of transactions small enough to fall below the review threshold Damien's oversight process was built to catch. Reeves had not been improvising. He had studied the oversight system, identified its blind spots, and built his extraction structure specifically around them, which required either considerable sophistication or considerable help. The help. When Nadia found it at 7 in the morning with a second cup of coffee and the Cayman Trust formation documents she had located through a private registry database she had accessed through a login she technically was not supposed to still have from her consulting firm days, turned out to be a man named Victor Castile, a mid-level partner at a rival organization that had spent the better part of 3 years attempting, through a series of failed negotiations and one very expensive lawsuit, to acquire 2 of the Caruso property holdings on the west side of Manhattan. Victor Castile had not only funded Reeves's patients, but had also, according to a wire transfer record she found attached to the trust's opening documentation, arranged for a separate payment to someone inside Damien's security detail, a payment dated 10 days earlier, which meant that whatever was being planned was not historical and was not finished and was timed to coincide with something on Damien's calendar that she did not yet know about. She called Marco, because Marco was the one she trusted after 2 months of watching him operate, and she called him on his personal cell rather than through any of the organizational lines, and she told him what she had found, and the sound Marco made when she finished was the sound of a man who had been in dangerous situations for 20 years recognizing the shape of one he had not seen coming. "He has a sit-down at the pier tonight," Marco said. "Castile's been trying to get that meeting on the calendar for months. Reeves put it in the diary last week as a real estate inspection." Nadia's stomach dropped. She had spent 29 years learning to take up less space, to draw less attention, to minimize herself for the comfort of rooms that had not asked for her and did not want her. Every instinct trained into her over that decade told her to forward the documentation to Marco and step back and let the people who knew how to handle these things handle it. She did not do that. She closed her laptop, put on the burgundy blazer, and called Damien directly, and when he answered on the second ring she said, flatly and without softening it, "Don't go to the pier tonight. Reeves, Castile, and someone inside your security team have been coordinating for at least 14 months, and whatever is waiting for you at that pier is not a real estate inspection." The silence was absolute. She heard him exhale. "Then, where are you right now?" "My apartment," she said. "Don't go anywhere," he said, and the command was not the controlled, precise language he usually used. It was something underneath that, urgent and stripped raw, the voice of a man responding not as an executive, but as something considerably more personal than that. "I'm sending Marco. Do not open your door to anyone else." She sat on her apartment floor with her laptop on her knees and the cold cup of coffee beside her and understood that she was no longer on the outside of anything. Marco arrived in 14 minutes, which told her something about what he had done with the 14 minutes. And the look on his face when she opened the door and handed him the printed documentation was the look of a man who had spent 20 years in dangerous situations and was actively revising his assessment of someone he had been watching carefully since October. "You found all of this in one night," Marco said. "It was not a question. I had a good database login and an accounting degree I wasn't using for much," Nadia said. Marco looked at her for a moment, then nodded in the specific way he nodded when he had decided something and did not need to say it out loud. Damien did not avoid the pier. He redirected it. What arrived at the West Side Pier that Friday evening was not the version of Damien Caruso that Castile and Reeves and whoever was inside the security detail had planned their ambush around, which was a man traveling without his full guard to what he believed was a routine property walkthrough. What arrived instead was a version of Damien Caruso that had spent 48 hours knowing exactly what was waiting and preparing accordingly, and it arrived with a precision that Nadia could only infer from the secondary effects, because she spent the entirety of that Friday evening in Marco's direct line of sight in a safe apartment 3 blocks from her own, sitting at a kitchen table with her laptop and a direct line to Marco's radio, doing the one thing she had ever been genuinely extraordinary at. She tracked the financial thread. While Marco's men were handling the physical situation at the pier, Nadia was tracing the Cayman Trust's asset movements in real time using access credentials she had been given by Damien's attorney that afternoon, watching the Trust's accounts with the focused, almost physical attention she had always given to numbers, and at 7:47 in the evening, she caught the attempt. A wire transfer initiation timed to coincide with what the conspirators had believed would be the chaos following. The ambush, an attempt to move the full $4.2 million into a secondary account in the Isle of Man that would have taken the money beyond practical recovery. She did not call Marco. She called the attorney directly and read him the wire transfer authorization number and the account routing code, and the attorney froze the transaction in 4 minutes, leaving the funds locked in the Cayman Trust pending the asset seizure process Damien had already set in motion through the appropriate channels. Victor Castile was detained at the pier. Reeves was located at JFK attempting to board an international flight with a passport that had not been issued to anyone named Gregory Reeves, which suggested he had been planning his exit for considerably longer than the past 14 months. The compromised security detail member, a man named Torres who had worked for the organization for 3 years, was removed from service without violence, which was, according to Marco's later telling, the most unambiguous signal to everyone in the organization's remaining structure of exactly how confident Damien was in the outcome. The pier itself was, by 9 in the evening, entirely quiet. Damien arrived at the apartment where Nadia had been stationed at 9:30, still dressed in the dark suit he had worn to the pier, and walked through the door Marco held open with the controlled, unhurried composure he wore everywhere, and then crossed the kitchen to where Nadia was sitting at the table and sat down in the chair across from her, without a word for a long moment, looking at her the way he had looked at her from the moment on the park bench when she had told him she was not the kind of woman men like him took to dinner, with the full, patient, particular quality of a man who had identified something he was not prepared to lose. "You froze the transfer," he said. "The attorney froze it," Nadia said. "I just told him where to look for minutes before it would have cleared," Damien said. "If it had cleared, the recovery process would have taken months and cost more than the sum involved." "I know," Nadia said. "I did the math." He looked at her for another moment, and then he said, "You found $41,000 in cash on a pavement and walked it back into a restaurant and asked for nothing. Then you found a $4 million theft inside a set of financial statements you were not asked to examine and called me at 2 in the morning to tell me about it. And tonight you froze an asset transfer that would have cost me 1.5 years worth of work." He paused. "Do you understand what I'm trying to tell you? That I'm useful?" Nadia said, because it was easier to say the reductive version first. "No," Damien said, and the word was quiet and final and left no space for negotiation. "That you are the only person who has ever simply done the right thing in front of me, without a single calculation about what it was worth. Do you understand how rare that is in the world I live in?" She looked at him across the kitchen table. This precise, terrifying, utterly singular man who had spent 15 years surrounded by people who wanted things from him, and understood that what she had given him on a Thursday evening in October by returning a wallet she could have kept was something he had not been given before and did not entirely know what to do with, and that the disorientation of it was the most human thing she had ever seen from him. She did not go back to Second Chance on Monday. She had intended to, had meant to walk in and price donations and reconcile the petty cash the way she had every Monday for the past 2 years, and she had even gotten as far as putting on her coat. But something had shifted in her over the Friday that had just passed. Some internal calibration that had been set wrong for so long, she had stopped noticing the error. And when she stood in front of her apartment door with her coat on and her bag over her shoulder, she found she could not make herself open it and walk back into the life she had built specifically around disappearing. She called the director and gave notice that afternoon, for days longer than required, because she respected the institution even if the institution had never quite respected her. And then she called Damien and told him she had resigned. The silence on the line was not the silence of surprise. It was the silence of a man who had been waiting for a particular conversation to arrive and was adjusting his posture accordingly. "Come in tomorrow," he said. "My attorney has a consulting agreement drafted. You review every financial statement that leaves this organization before I sign anything, starting immediately, and you are compensated at a rate that reflects what that review is actually worth rather than what a non-profit in the Flatiron District was paying you to do it." "I don't want to be paid to be in your life," Nadia said. "I'm not offering to pay you to be in my life," Damien replied evenly. "I'm offering to pay you to be in my business, which is a different thing, and I would appreciate it if you did not confuse the two." She sat with that for a moment. "What's the difference?" she asked. "The business arrangement," Damien said, "is because you are the most precise financial mind I have encountered in 15 years of working with people who are very well paid to be precise. That part you have earned independently of anything else between us." He paused. "The other part," he said, and the composure fractured just slightly. Just enough? Is because you returned my wallet and asked for nothing. And I have not been able to stop thinking about that since October. And I do not think I was built to stop. Nadia was quiet for a long moment, standing in her coat in her apartment with the afternoon light coming through the window. I'm not thin, she said, and said it the way she had said it the first time in the park, quickly and without apology, because it was still the thing she half expected to be the wall. I'm not interested in thin, Damien said, with the same absolute and unhurried certainty he brought to everything he meant. I am interested in you. Those are not comparable categories to me. I would appreciate it if they stopped being comparable to you. She had no answer for that, not a quick one. And so she said nothing, and he said nothing, and the silence between them was the kind that meant something rather than the kind that meant nothing, the kind she had not expected to learn to recognize in the company of this particular man, but had, somewhere over the past 2 months, learned to identify with a precision she had not previously applied to anything that was not a balance sheet. She came in on Tuesday with her laptop and a printed copy of the property company's last 3 annual statements, and she sat in the office down the hall from Damien's and worked through them until the early evening. And when she finally closed her laptop and put on her coat, he appeared in the doorway with his jacket still on and asked if she had eaten, and she said no. And he said neither had he. And they walked out together into the December evening with his hand at the small of her back. And that was how it was settled, without ceremony and without theater, the way Damien Caruso apparently settled all things that mattered to him. A month later, at a dinner attended by every person of consequence in the organization's business world, Damien stood at the head of the table with Nadia beside him and told the room that Nadia Reyes was the organization's new director of financial integrity, that she would be reviewing every agreement the company executed going forward, and that anyone who had questions about her presence or her authority was welcome to raise them directly with him, at which point nobody raised any questions at all. She had walked into a room one Thursday evening in October expecting nothing and had walked back out of it with $41,000 belonging to someone else, handed it back without being asked, and had eventually learned that doing the right thing when nobody was watching was the most legible thing a person could do in a world built entirely on people watching each other. She had spent her whole life being told the space she took up was the problem. She had turned out to be exactly the right size for the life she had been walking toward without knowing it. Was Nadia right to trust the most dangerous man in the city simply because he was the first person to see her clearly? Or do you think some rooms are too dangerous to walk into twice? Let us know in the comments below. If this story kept you guessing from the first wallet to the last wire transfer, smash that like button right now. Share it with a friend who needs a fierce, brilliant heroine in their life. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss another dark, romantic story where the most overlooked person in the room turns out to be the one who changes everything. Turn on notifications, because next time someone underestimates a woman who asked for nothing, you will want to be there when the room finally understands its mistake.